Okay, now that I've done that, I can do this properly. Okay. Okay, so sorry about that. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Irish Entomology pre-meet seminar. In our first pre-meet seminar earlier this week, we explored stoneflies and the process of revising the Northern Ireland priority species list. We linked these together by delving deeper into issues of data deficiency and limitations of taxonomic expertise in more specialized areas. We also briefly tapped into the accessibility of biological recording, especially if you're just starting out. So things like finance and things like that crept up in the discussion. This seminar session considers two different talks, but we'll continue that conversation by looking at the grander ideas that can help protect our invertebrates and connect habitats. These topics will challenge policy, especially in planning for incorporating biodiversity and invertebrates, or the influence of designation of sites. But there will be some challenges with those. When we get to it, I do hope people will join in for the discussion. I would ask to use the reaction of raising hand within Zoom itself, and to use your microphone if you can. But if you're more comfortable just in chat, obviously feel free to do that, and we'll just read it out. On there. But yeah, I would like to also repeat that the Irish Entomology Meeting is firstly about celebrating all who have that passion for invertebrates right here across the island of Ireland. But yeah, so I'm Josh, and I'm the Conservation Officer for Buglife in Northern Ireland, and I'm facilitating this Irish Entomology Meeting alongside Dr. Helen Barber-James, the Senior Curator of Natural History at the National Museums of Northern Ireland, with the conference being funded by DERA's Environment Fund. Buglife and the museum share goals about wanting to create that lasting legacy of entomologists across Ireland, and we're actively sharing our expertise for this. Buglife's main aim is to save invertebrates from extinction and achieves this through species recovery projects for most threatened species, and raising awareness for issues like pesticide use, light pollution, climate change, and habitat loss. We're currently building up our conservation projects in Northern Ireland, and some may know about previous projects involving the Zycron reed beetle in Fermanagh, the Northern Calides on the North Coast, and feasibility our studies on mosaic habitats, or right now the Belfast Buzzing project led by my colleague Hannah, who will be giving a talk tomorrow. I myself have been involved with helping to assess invertebrate features of designated sites. And very soon we'll be looking to get more conservation volunteers for upcoming projects, so please do get in contact about that. Our first speaker is Nina of Ulster Wildlife, who has a wealth of experience in conservation, restoration and policy, and has applied this to delivering nature recovery networks. Nina will be telling us more about these nature recovery networks and how this may apply to invertebrates for their conservation. Our second speaker of the night is Buglife's very own programs manager, Jamie Robbins, who along with his team has been integral in developing or expanding many of Buglife's projects like beelines and what he's going to be talking about today, important invertebrate areas, particularly how this may apply to Ireland from what we've so far learned from Britain. From our previous seminar, we did allow for some quick questions between us, but we will save most of them for the open discussion. And without further ado, I will introduce then our first speaker, Nina. It's okay. Oh,
yes, I have learned the lesson. Thanks, Josh. I'll just try to see how well this screen sharing will go. How does that look?
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. I see. Just your presentation. Yeah.
So perfect.
Perfect.
Happy for me to go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh, and thanks for having me. First of all, I'll try my very best to stick to the allocated 15 minutes, but I'm not giving any promises. But yeah, so my talk today is really going to be about the work that we've been doing to basically take steps towards realizing nature recovery networks for Northern Ireland, and what we have been working on in the last couple of years. And I will preface my talk by very honestly admitting that I'm by no means an entomologist, so I don't allow any tricky questions during the Q&A. They will all go to Josh or Jamie. So just to quickly explain, I guess, what this initiative has been all about, which has all originally been all about building capacity to deliver a nature recovery network to Northern Ireland. So this was an initiative that has been going on since mid-September 2020. And it has very much been a partnership initiative under what we call the Northern Ireland Landscape Partnership, which would be comprised of Ulster Wildlife, where I sit, National Trust, RSPB, and Woodland Trust. So we've been basically working together on this initiative for the last couple of years, or 2.5 years by now. And the focus has really been for the initiative to kind of start to build this evidence base and start to provide resources towards making this NRN delivery an actual reality in Northern Ireland. And that has included quite a bit of mapping and modeling, and I will obviously touch upon those in the following slides. But it's also been very much about kind of sharing our learnings and upskilling the wider sector as well as ourselves, and making recommendations going forward when it comes to policy and practice. So why are we talking about NRNs in the first place? Probably for most of us on the call today, it's not really news that, you know, habitat loss and fragmentation, they have really been big drivers of biodiversity loss globally, but very much so as well in Northern Ireland. So therefore, these principles of habitat area, habitat quality, and connectivity, they really have been recorded as sort of key ingredients for any sound conservation policy, but we don't really have a good track record of implementing that in Northern Ireland or UK. So the theory itself isn't necessarily new. There are some countries that have been working on this for a good 30 odd years, and it kind of raised its heads in the first time in the 1970s. But in the UK, it was not really until 2010 when quite an influential report called Making Space for Nature, or often referred to as the Lawton Report, came out. And that report really concluded that our existing protected areas and the ways we are doing things at the moment just isn't enough to safeguard our biodiversity. And he basically made this recommendation that we need more, bigger, better, and more joined up spaces for nature, and crucially also for people. And these are often referred to as Lawton principles, which might be a familiar term to people. I have a quick video on the next slide. I have never attempted this. It's a 2-minute video, so hopefully it would work. But Josh, do just shout in case the audio or the picture doesn't work. But hopefully this will set the scene quite nicely.
Ooh, just wondering, is there meant to be sound on the video?
Yes, there's supposed to be sound. Is it just the subtitles that you can see?
I can just see the subtitles, yeah.
Right. We might skip that. I can just give everybody the link later on, as much as it has the subtitles, but it's quite nice to see or hear the sound. So I'll just share the links. We've got it on YouTube as well, so I'll share it for later if anyone is interested, but we'll skip that. It was a good attempt, didn't work. But yeah, happy to go ahead, and I'll move on to the next slide. Sorry about that. So, well, I guess in very simple terms, no matter whether we've seen the video or not, you know, NRNs are really about, you know, moving from this fragmented landscape that we have now to something that is a lot more thriving and self-functioning and connected. So hopefully you can kind of see the difference between these two images in terms of what we are trying to achieve. So in terms of the actual components, there's probably a lot of familiar terminology here. We're talking about obviously the identification of these critical core areas in need of protection. You know, these could be important invertebrate areas. It's very much about focusing on conserving biodiversity at a landscape or at least a regional scale, something that we haven't really done so far. It's been very site specific. And overall, it's about really maintaining and strengthening and boosting this, our kind of overall ecological coherence, I guess you could say, by increasing connectivity and providing corridors and stepping stones for our species. And it's also about, you know, buffering these critical and important areas to protect them really from kind of effects of potentially damaging activities outside of those sites. So fundamentally, it's really about creating this, I guess, coherent network of ecologically important areas that are functionally and not just structurally connected. And furthermore, beyond the kind of original terminology of talking about ecological networks, nature cover networks are really all about kind of acknowledging the additional benefits that these spaces can also provide for people in terms of ecosystem services. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions for flood alleviation, for air purification, and so on. So I guess what we have done as a project was that we took these long-term principles and we undertook this big mapping exercise and produced what we call these national habitat networks for Northern Ireland. So we basically took information on where we do currently have priority habitats and habitat patches and modeled those kind of that potential for more bigger, better, and more connected. That was based on, you know, where do we have those appropriate conditions when it comes to a particular habitat type. In this question, what is on the screen is the bog network. So we are looking at soil type, we're looking at elevation, we're looking at, you know, distance to an existing nearby patch. And this is the sort of thing that we come out with. And obviously what you see those red lines there, that's our ASSI boundaries. So those areas of special scientific interest. I just thought it was quite nice to kind of see how much of those networks do get picked up by our protected areas. Beyond that, a lot more recently, as of this week, really, we've also looked at the climate change vulnerability of these networks. And these have been very much based on these variables that I've listed there on the screen. And we really considered that assessing the vulnerability of these, both these kind of existing networks, but those kind of that potential restoration activity that we've highlighted there, and how that is an important consideration when it comes to targeting and prioritizing actions and interventions in order for us to really ensure that, you know, we can have the biggest impact when it comes to, you know, resilience against climate change, but also when it comes to, you know, taking those actions, making sure that they're sustainable in the long term. So it's all really about kind of, if we were to take action, you know, where can we get the best bang for our buck? And I think on the next screen there, yeah, I've got the example there of the kind of overall where all of those different parts have been brought together for the bog network. And you can kind of see that there's certain areas that kind of pick out in more yellow than green or blue, especially in the sperrins and around the kind of river van. So basically what we are looking at there, it's indicating that those areas are more vulnerable and potentially should be prioritized for action over other sites. So what does this mean for the invertebrates? Haven't mentioned them yet, really. It's really making sure that the evidence, the know-how we have about invertebrates feeds into the decision-making and the design for NRN delivery. And obviously Jane will be talking about those important invertebrate areas, so what that might look like. So if we had these kind of core areas for invertebrates and these kind of local assemblages of importance identified, it's about making sure that these parts of the network would be secured and protected, as well as actually strategically kind of added on to boost that existing network of sites that are good for invertebrates, because bugs are cool. When we think about delivery mechanisms, we could look at our planning system. We could look at our agri-environment schemes. So if we talk about our planning system, ensuring first of all that our biodiversity duty in the first place is fit for purpose to protect these areas, and ensuring that developments don't harm these sites. But further on, many of you might have heard of the term of biodiversity net gain. It's about making sure that, or allowing potentially for the fact that developments could potentially actually add on to these existing networks by basically ensuring that you have more biodiversity after development than before. Something that is very much a kind of ongoing discussion at the moment. But likewise, our agri-environment schemes, if 70% of our land in Northern Ireland is under farming, how could we design our future kind of farming support schemes in a way that would, again, both protect and potentially enhance our existing networks. So if Nina there in the top corner is imagining a world and a landscape in the Belfast Hills, and we have a map like this, if we knew and we got together as stakeholders involved in the landscape and got together and we knew where the important populations were, we could start looking at, adding more there, making that site bigger, improving the condition there, adding connectivity in the most fragmented bits. These are the kind of things that we could start, pulling out from these sort of maps. Obviously, this is a very crude version of that, but I'm sure you can get the principles. And hopefully that will lead to a lot of happy bugs. So really to finalize, I guess, going forward, if all of my wildest dreams were to be realized, I would really like to see NRNs, to play a key role in guiding decision-making for nature across all sorts of policy and, government and public bodies. But for this to happen, we do really need leadership and coordination from our public bodies and, crucially, our government, which isn't very stable at the moment. We do need a really clear framework for everyone to have a clear role to play, and for all of us to be able to come together and kind of come together in a complementary manner. So the actions that we take through different ways are all contributing towards a shared goal. And it's not really that we're not already doing a lot of great work in Northern Ireland. It's really about that kind of scaling up and coordination around all of that. And when it comes to the evidence side of things, this is exactly where we can start talking about these maps and what Jamie's going to be talking about after. What are our species needs? Are there any evidence gaps that we need to be filling? And all of that to be able to feed into the kind of design and framework for the NRN delivery. And obviously, money is always the easy answer to everything. If we had all the money in the world, a lot of this would be a lot easier. So obviously we need to start thinking about, potentially some new ways of resourcing the actual delivery and not relying on existing mechanisms. And I think that's really me. I've included my email there and details to our kind of social channels. If you want to have a look at some of those videos, for example, we've got more on there on our YouTube channel as well. But obviously, this has very much been a very whistle-stop tour and very scratching the surface sort of a talk. So hopefully you'll have some more questions during the Q&A, and I will do my best to answer them, but obviously happy to talk outside of the webinar today as well. But I'll pass on to you, Josh and Jamie. Hopefully successfully stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Yeah, I suppose we could have even just one question just before Jimmy, and then if anyone, I suppose I do see Rosie has a comment in the chat box there about saying it would be interesting to see how populations and multiple social deprivation index relates to the nature networks and changes communities need to make to take action.
100%. Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, I think oh, I see Helen has her hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to comment. I think this is very exciting work, and I was interested in noting that you mentioned both the Sperrins and the Belfast Hills as sites of importance. And I study freshwater insects, and recently I've been doing work both in the Ballinderry Rivers Trust and up into the Sperrins, and also just on sort of weekend trips looking around for things. And in the Belfast Hills at Carr Glen, we found the first ever record of a certain limnophilid caddisfly. And we found umpteen new species, or not new, but very rare and under-recorded, and perhaps first records for Ireland, or Northern Ireland at least, in the Sperrins. So it's definitely, there's a lot to be done with just a bit of survey work. There's so much to be uncovered. We've only been working for a couple of months and have already got quite a lot of exciting records. I'll be talking more about that tomorrow.
Cool, yeah.
Thanks for that, Helen. I guess I do want to say that the kind of sites and maps that I used, they weren't pulled out onto the screen for any particular purpose or to highlight those sites specifically, I guess. I haven't really been able to, especially to the climate change vulnerability work, I haven't really assessed the whole set of data sets, which is a myriad of data sets. So that's why I, for example, put that sign for like, please don't take pictures yet, because we haven't really assessed, what the big picture is. But even looking at that simple map there, it really seems to be telling a bit of a story. So it's clearly a question that we need to be exploring more. And it's really exciting to hear about those new records, Helen. And that's exactly the kind of things that can start feeding into this whole kind of framework in terms of, if we understand that there's certain species present, what does that mean for that decision making? So that's really exciting.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you to Helen and Rosie for those comments there. We'll get back then into that in the open discussion, but now we will move to Jimmy to discuss important invertebrate areas. So thanks again.
Brilliant, thanks Josh, thanks Nina. Can you hear me okay, I take it?
Yeah.
I should. I think I'd remember how to, there we go, share screen. Sorry, I'm very used to Teams. Here we go. I've just, sorry, 1 second. I'm prepared, honestly. There we go. Right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. I'm here, as Josh said at the beginning, to talk about our important invertebrate areas work. This is on a GB basis, so it's based on England, Scotland, and Wales and our experience there, with the intention of it being something to kind of get yourselves thinking about whether or how something like this might work for Ireland. And off the back of Nina's presentation, I suppose it's worth saying that for something like a nature recovery network to work and to really deliver, we need to make sure that we've got all the information in there for invertebrates. It needs to be based on as sound information as you can possibly get. It's worth pointing out that across the British Isles, we've seen landscape recovery type schemes and landscape scale conservation efforts come and go over the years, whatever's the new trendy thing every decade. But while all of that's been going on with very good intentions and fantastic organizations feeding into it, we have still been overseeing massive declines in our invertebrates. So, now that we're doing the nature recovery networks, now is the time to step up and make sure that we have invertebrate species as the very basis of that. So there'll be a few links to what Nina was talking about as we go through. So very quickly, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about what an important invertebrate area is, tell you how we identified that network in GB, the fine scale mapping work that we're doing now, which will make sense once I start talking, and then end with more of a question really of what an IA network for Ireland should be and how it would work, using hopefully as part of the discussion around NRNs as well, we're using all of your expertise. So what are important invertebrate areas? So in GB, there are lots of areas we know are fantastic for invertebrates. They're in every nature recovery network and predecessor. All of the entomologists we know flock there, places like South Devon Coast, Dartmoor, the Gwent Levels, Windsor Great Park, the Gower Peninsula, the Cairngorms. These are iconic national places with outstanding habitats. And although there's a bit of a light's been shone recently on how national parks could be managed better for the wildlife within them, we still know that they are home to some of our rarest and most threatened species, things you often find nowhere else, and they're truly important places. But is just protecting those core places enough? What we're trying to do with the important invertebrate areas data in GB is to follow the data, essentially, and the knowledge of experts to find out where those nationally and internationally important places are for invertebrates and their habitats. Sounds a very simple job, but it's a lot more complex than you'd imagine. And moving forward, we see this as being a vital tool to help our most threatened species, but also make sure that important landscapes are better managed for the more widespread but declining species that we hear so much about. In terms of why we need IAs, there's plenty of designations out there, there's plenty of activity ongoing, particularly with the uptick in interest in invertebrates in the last 10 years, thanks to a lot of attention being paid to bees and other pollinators. But what we need is something that at the country level can help to direct and focus all of that effort. There's a lot of a smattering here and there of conservation effort, and this is to help try and coordinate and focus that effort. And importantly, to going back to what Nina said, we need to make sure that we are protecting our most important wildlife sites. So what we can do here is try and identify if protected area networks, if those statutory sites are genuinely protecting our most important invertebrate sites, see where the gaps are, and push for those gaps to be filled. It's also an important opportunity for us to raise the profile of invertebrates with decision makers. Anyone that's worked with invertebrates will know they're often overlooked in favor of the more glamorous and furry, charismatic megafauna of the world. This is our chance to try and give a named status of sorts to sites supporting invertebrates. And of course, it means that we can help to improve the management and protection of sites within that. And another thing Nina said was about trying to stop sites from being destroyed. Well, I also lead on Buglife's planning work. So from my point of view, a big part of this is trying to ensure we have better planning outcomes for invertebrates by getting them considered earlier in the process. There's a lot that IAs can essentially achieve. And to do this, we need to make sure we've got digestible, easily understandable information out there. We could put out reams and reams of spreadsheets of data of different species, but it's turning that into something that decision makers at all levels can understand and making it accessible information. So what we're working towards in GB is having an online web map where you can simply zoom into your area, see where your IAs are, click on it and download the maps and find information about it. All of this, of course, being based on very sound data. So what we did in GB was we worked with the best data we could find. We decided the way to do it was to work with all the verified data from our national recording schemes, a whole 80 plus of them. I think it's nearer 85 now, and over 45 million invertebrate records, which is an enormous amount of data that goes into this. This list is on our website if anyone's interested. But looking at the list at the background there, you've got things like the Soldier Flies and Allies recording scheme, the Tenebrionidae recording scheme, the Scaraboidae recording scheme. Absolutely, you can take your pick. We've got a huge amount of information feeding into this. It's fantastic. And when the IA work started about 6 years ago, there was also a conversation about how we were going to select areas for our IAs. Was it just finding the areas with the most species, which of course is problematic because that very much focuses on areas that are most surveyed. You could end up with an entomologist's back garden based on the fact that they surveyed every invertebrate taxa they can find. And it also looked at the idea of endemic species as well. But it was decided that going on the basis of threat statuses was the way forward. So our IAs in GB can qualify a hectare, so a 10 by 10k square is how we do it. Can qualify based on two different criteria. There's our criteria A species, which are our jewel in the crown species. So those are species that are globally endangered. I won't read it all out there, but a globally endangered species, a European endangered species, or a nationally critically endangered species on one of the British national red lists. or similarly, if an area supports one of our 20 odd endemic species in GB. So if a hectad has a single post 1990, that was our cutoff date, record for any of those species, it can qualify as an IEA. And there's a second tier, which is for a nationally important assemblage of rare or threatened invertebrates. And to do this, a hectad has to exceed a threshold for a set number of those species. Those are species which are, as you can see on the list there, either a lower level of a European designation, endangered on one of our red lists, or identified as nationally rare. So these are all based on published status reviews. Where there are gaps, we have relied on some expert knowledge for where there are gaps within that. And this would be something worth discussing at the end when we talk about how an IA network might practically be done for Ireland. And this is what we did when we took all of that data and put it through this those criteria. We ended up with this broad scale map, which is all of our GB hectads that qualify as IAs. We grouped them together into roughly 100 named important invertebrate areas. They range in size from the tiny ones like the Great Orme Peninsula in Wales and Lundy, through to the massive South Downs IA, which is 31 hectares, so an awful lot to map. But that's great. This map here, it's useful. It reinforces what I think a lot of people would have thought. You know, areas, if you know the habitats in GB, areas of distinctive habitat like the Cairngorms, the Brecks, the Fens, and the Surrey Heaths come up, the Welsh uplands, as do all the coastal areas, which often have some of our species at the northern limit of their range. But to make real sense of it, we have to do fine scale mapping. So we've been doing this progressively over 4 or 5 years now. And that we kind of step away then from being that entirely data-led approach to sourcing data from local record centres and recorders, and running interactive workshops with the local expertise and knowledge, helping us identify where there's errors in the data, because you of course can't blindly accept data. These things are only ever going to be as good as the data going into them, that old chestnut. But using local expertise, not just about data and areas of higher importance, but understanding the habitats and the landscape and what the ongoing threats are. So I'm just going to talk you through some of the mapping that we did. With this example here from the Thames Estuary. This is all done online now, by the way. We did originally do it all, huddled around a table, scribbling onto maps, but the pandemic forced us to change and actually found a more efficient way of getting it done that ensures everyone's able to feed in. So we run sessions where, after a similar presentation to this, but a bit more dull and long-winded, I'm afraid, for everyone that has to endure them, we look at online maps like this, which the dots showing records of different species, and the different coloured backgrounds are different protected area statuses or nature reserves, for example. And very simply, together on an online whiteboard, we scribble on maps. So everyone feeds in, we put sticky notes on, and we start to build up the expertise in the room, interpreting that data and teasing out that network of sites. And then we digitize them into these lovely shape files here, which we are trying to make as widely available as we can as we progress that work. So that is our IA. But each one is different. They'll, depending on where you are within the country and the surrounding habitats. So this example here is from the Fens in the east of England, which, if you don't know, is a very agriculturally intensive landscape, to the extent that it just suffered a lot of drainage. If you zoom in close, you can see a lot of the network of drainage ditches on that. And those pink areas are, of course, our important invertebrate areas network. And you can see the difference between this in the Thames Estuary, where there's it's not undergone quite as much extensive drainage. You've still got coastal drainage marsh, coastal grazing marsh there, and this, where the interest for invertebrates has been more or less entirely restricted to our triple SI network and a small handful of nature reserves and local wildlife sites, unfortunately. But I'll also take the opportunity quickly to talk about those criteria A species. So it's great that we've got these big landscapes that are covering these extensive habitats. But there are some species that are really localized. These are the things that are potentially our most threatened species that are critically endangered within our own status reviews. So for them, we do have dedicated IAs just for them, where there is no accompanying assemblage that reaches the threshold. An example here on the northwest coast, on the Sefton coast of England, is the Ainsdale Sand Dunes important invertebrate area, which is in there just for the critically endangered dung beetle, Aphodius brevis. So we didn't need to run a workshop for something like this. We were able simply to talk to experts, the people that know the species, that know the site, and map out both the areas that have the existing records, but also the suitable area of the grazed dune with suitable dung for the species where they're likely to exist. So this is within a national nature reserve and a triple assign network above the mean high water mark. So it's quite easy to do. Similarly, another critically endangered one, terrestrial species, is our western wood-vase hoverfly, Myolepta potens, which is a species of rot holes in veteran horse chestnuts. That should have been easier for me to remember. So this is in the west of England, and again, with this we were able to work with local experts. It's a very difficult to survey species, very seldom seen. We were able to work with the species group experts and people that know the site to be able to map out that IA network. And just to mix it up and show you as much as I can in 50 minutes, the range of how these IAs are being mapped. This is the Ian Valley up in Cumbria in England, which is an IA just for the freshwater pearl mussel, which, as I'm sure you know, we've got the British Isles has globally important populations of as an endangered species. So for this one, based on the fact it's a freshwater species where water quality is a significant issue in sedimentation, we took a bit more of a kind of catchment approach where we've got a buffer along the River Ian and its source up in Ennerdale Water. So how we're going to treat that IA is, of course, going to be quite different to how we treat an IA where we've mapped out individual small areas of habitat. And this is where we've got to so far in about 4 years of fine scale mapping. The blue squares you can see on there have been mapped. You see Wales is completed. And keep an eye out to see what we do in Wales later this year when we launch our IAs and have a report. And in red, those areas have not yet been mapped and the green areas are underway. So it's a big commitment. It's an awful lot of work, but we're making good progress with it. So producing maps is fantastic. That's one thing. To make sure that this information is genuinely accessible and digestible and usable to everyone from ecologists to conservation organizations, decision makers, local authorities, we're producing profile documents for each of those IAs. Which, as you can imagine, is quite a time-consuming task. Within them, we're characterizing the IA, the reasons for its selection, and we're identifying some key species and key assemblages. So we're really drilling down into not just the habitats, but the actual fine-scale habitat associations, and trying to identify the species associated with them to try and take what's a hugely complicated set of information and make it something that many people can understand. And we're also including the local threats and opportunities. And this is all done in consultation with people that were at the workshop and know the landscape. So it's not generic threats and opportunities. We're trying to really make sure that they're relevant to that area of interest. And each of those profiles is up to about 8 sides. So there's good information there, but it's not trying to be the complete Bible of how to manage habitats and species within IAs. It's just trying to identify that information in the first instance. And all of them will be accessible from our web map. And in terms of those IAs now, I'm kind of repeating what I said and a bit of what Nina said, but this is an opportunity for us to identify those core areas for invertebrates. So we can make sure that they find their way into nature recovery networks as they're developing. And again, with the planning hat on, there's an opportunity here for us to share this information with local authorities and make sure it appears within data searches and things like that. So that the earliest opportunity, invertebrates are considered. And again, touching on the protected area network, a lot of this is repeating what I said at the beginning. This is developing a landscape scale approach to better decision making for invertebrates. And that's kind of it from me. You know, all I will say is, in terms of why would we need an IA network for Ireland, you guys may well know more than me, and we'll find out when we have a chat. It's exactly as we suggested. It's helping highlight important habitats, identify protected area network gaps, and make that information simple, make it accessible, and to identify overlaps with other conservation priorities, and hopefully inform something like the nature recovery network, so we can make sure that this time landscape scale planning for conservation genuinely delivers for invertebrates and they don't slip through the cracks again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. Sorry, hear an echo there. So I suppose, sorry, I'm still hearing an echo. Should I open it to the floor then, if anyone has a question for Jimmy to start with? Yeah, so I'll start out with just a quick question. And like generally then, how do landowners, I suppose, how do they respond to more designations and things? Is it more accessible? Is it accepted, or is there any pushback? Or
How did who react? Sorry, I missed the first bit.
how would landowners and things react to more designations? Is it positive?
Go right in there for a difficult one, why don't you? Well, at the moment, because the IA network is still in its infancy, we've not been using it yet to identify. We kind of feel we need to have the whole country's network done to be able to fully take a step back and look at the overlap with the protected area network. We did some pilot work in Wales, and with 4 IAs we looked at, it varied from 20% of an IA being within the protected area network to 80, which, depending on how you look at it, either means that there's lots of areas of interest that aren't covered in the example of 20%, or in the example where 80% of them were covered, is that because the wider landscape is just that knackered that all the remaining areas of wildlife are currently within SSIs. But when we have those conversations with landowners, it'll be very interesting, but we're not quite at that stage yet.
Thank you. Oh, I see Brian has a stand up there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Josh. Just to introduce myself, I'm Brian Nelson. I work for National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Republic. I'm the invertebrate ecologist, plowing a very lone furrow. Well, I'm not actually. There's another person does Margaret Tiffer. I deal with everything else. But our focus is largely on European things. But that was a very interesting talk, Jamie. Thanks very much for giving it. Pity actually it's not part of the main conference. Actually, it would be useful. But certainly, it's thinking that, you know, I've been having, and some of the talks tomorrow, my own talk on red lists, and Adam's going to give a talk on our proposals for designating species as nationally rare. Well, all Ireland rare and all Ireland scarce will be presented for the first time. So we are building the framework for identifying species that are high conservation concern in Ireland. You know, our red list program is happening. It's rather slow, but we're certainly not near as advanced. But we are getting there slowly, and logically it is leading up to what you did. I do have an important invertebrate area program already in the Republic, and Buglife actually done some of the surveys. They are surveys of individual sites as opposed to that large scale. So I'll have to give up that title if we take up your program, which I thought was tremendous. I mean, all these mapping projects are always, they're the logical outcome, things that we could do which we could not do 20 years ago, because we just, you know, would have all been paper and all the rest of it. So getting all this data together and analyzing it in the way you've done it is brilliant. And yeah, well done. Yeah, and I hope that we can maybe certainly, you know, consider doing that in Northern Ireland. So I'd be happy to have a discussion about it at some stage with you.
That'd be brilliant, fantastic. What I would say is sometimes there's a lot of focus gets put on the data that we don't have and the gaps we have, and that's absolutely the case. Even in very well recorded countries, there's always gaps, both geographically and taxonomically. But what we're finding with the IA work in GB is that even where there are gaps in some taxa, it seems like we're still picking up the important sites for them based on the information we have from the better recorded groups. So yeah, people are getting quite concerned at gaps when actually they should focus on the fact that there is a surprising amount of overlap, and we still have really good knowledge of some taxa.
Yeah, gaps in knowledge is always. Helen's already addressed that, and it often needs someone like Helen with a fresh eye coming to Ireland, and she goes to places that perhaps other people have dismissed or forgotten about. But gaps is always. But my view on that is that if you don't do it, if you keep waiting for those gaps to be filled, then you're just going to create new gaps for yourself. It is quite frightening how little data we do have for some species, but we have enough that we can at least make a start. And it may be imperfect, but if you don't make a start, I mean, our red lists are definitely lacking data, and so, but you know, we've made a stab at doing it, and it is the best view at this time, which is as best you can do, I think, at the moment.
Well, the two things I was going to say that what we always caveat the important invertebrate area thing by saying, because it's only as good as the data going in, and somewhere outside of an IEA doesn't mean it's not important for invertebrates.
No.
You know, this is all based on priorities and where we know things to be, but there's always an awful lot of unknowns. And the other thing to point out is the methodology itself is designed to be repeatable. So, you know, if we do this in 10 years' time, for example, those gaps will hopefully be filled. And also, I like to think that what it will also do is, when there's gaps, is anger those entomologists who aren't in the IEA, motivate them to get out surveying their patch and submitting their data and not just leaving it in a notebook. So hopefully we can use IEAs to help fill those knowledge gaps as well, or in fact use it as a way of, you know, getting funding to target surveys and there's lesser surveyed areas as well. So it can be a driver to get more data as well as being based on data, I think. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Now, again, that's another good reason for producing red lists and things like that. It gets people thinking about, oh, the species is you know, not been recorded for X years. Let's go out and find it, and you know, that produces positive results. And Atlas I'm a great believer in Atlas. Has produced quite a few myself, so I think that they are data that is invaluable in that sense. So gaps are important. I was interested in your comment about assemblages, because that's an area that really worries me at the moment with recording, where people go out and record with their phones and they take pictures of one or two species. The habit of taking species lists, that's how I started out recording. It seems to be lacking. People seem to be satisfied, oh, I've seen one thing here. Well, why do you not go and find the rest of the species in that group at that site? I wish people would get back into that habit, and I do unfortunately blame the phone and this online recording. Hopefully it's a fashion which will end, but
you want old-fashioned site and square bashing is what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you learn about your species, because if you try and find all your species, then you learn where they live. So to me, it's extremely frustrating whenever you get presented with a picture and you know the person didn't look for anything else. You know, anyway, I'm a bit grey in this grey beard about that one, but I think it's a worrying trend, which I hope will be reversed.
I'll let Josh take over again from here.
Oh no, that's great discussions there. I suppose
Thanks, Brian.
Like to bring in Nina as well and stuff. So obviously then with the nature recovery network stuff, that is the Lawton principles of bigger, better, more connected and stuff. Is it the case with IIAs, for example? Like we did mention it's like the gaps and stuff, but like, is it the case to you eventually want to increase the important invertebrate areas, or expand them out, or just focus on protecting and conserving what's there, or generally you just want to expand that out, basically, or if that made sense.
So I guess I think I just interpreted you correctly. So I mean, you know, the IEAs are mapping the best areas that are left. So yes, there's an issue of making sure that the areas within them are better managed, but just keeping things to where they are now clearly isn't working. We need to look outside of those protected area networks as well. Better, it goes to like what Nina was saying with the NRM, using those basic principles of the bigger, better, more joined up thing, which means if you've got your IEAs mapped, you know where there's important habitats and areas are. So you'd like to think that from an invertebrate standpoint, those should be the areas you're looking to improve connectivity between and increase the size of those sites with, you know, potentially the buffers around them being a focus for habitat creation to try and help those remaining sites be bigger and more resilient. I think that was answering your question. Yeah. It might have answered a completely different question.
Oh yeah, so it's the question was flexible in the sense of what it so, but yeah, I suppose data deficiency is also another big problem, especially here in Northern Ireland. Like Helen mentioned earlier about the spurrins, and it is the case that there is some, for example, Northern Ireland prairie species that are up there, and yeah, I suppose how do we tackle those in either a nature recovery network or important invertebrate areas? Like, would we suggest that we would encourage people to go out and record those areas, or do we just deal with what we kind of can gather already from recording schemes and things.
I'm looking at Nina's camera. She doesn't know I'm looking at her camera.
Well, that is not an easy answer. Obviously, there is a wealth of data that we have. So obviously that is the starting point, isn't it? Understanding, you know, what is the current status or current status based on information that we have available. But going back to kind of what Jamie was saying there about, or the conversation that we were having, or you guys were having with Brian about, you know, evidence gaps. I think it's really important that we do identify those, but it probably we know enough, I'm sure, at this point in time where we can go ahead with a lot in terms of, you know, taking action now, but also planning for the long term. And I guess that was something that we always kind of were quite sensitive to, even when we started on our own mapping. Like Jamie repeated several times, you know, your outputs in terms of fancy models are only ever going to be as good as your inputs and the information going into them. And we knew that we were going to have evidence gaps, but also data that was old. It doesn't mean that it's completely irrelevant, but if our, let's say, prior to habitat inventory for peatlands is older than me, there's probably is some ground truthing that needs to go into actually sense checking what the models are throwing out at the other end. So I guess that's something that I'm always try to be quite clear on when I have these conversations, is that even the maps that we have, obviously they are based on the best evidence that we had available. It could have been better, 100%, but the maps themselves are not giving you exact answers. And that's why we were talking about, you know, what about the extra layers of information on climate change, you know, species in that area and the species needs in that area, you know, bringing in that local expertise on board. So for me, these maps and these kind of proposals, they are only about potential. They are not actual opportunities of what you should be doing on the ground. And that's where it's almost like the starting point for me in terms of, you know, this is based on the best evidence that we have, the proposals that our models have thrown out. There could be several proposals even overlapping in one area. And that's when we need to come, you know, choose the boundaries of that landscape, bring the stakeholders on board and have that conversation based on that expertise, whether it's recorded or in people's brains. You know, there's a lot of that expertise that hasn't even been recorded. It's bringing that into that room and start kind of going through, okay, what makes sense, what's practical, what's deliverable, you know, who owns the land, what is the actual opportunity here. So I guess what I always try to make sure that I mention at some point when I talk about the maps, that the maps are highlighting potential. And that's where the ground truthing will always, you know, undoubtedly have to come into play. You know, the maps, I guess, give you ideas and direction of travel, but you will always need to go on ground truth. Are those proposals making sense? What is the know-how and understanding in the landscape for species needs and where we need to go? And that's when you started to actually talk about what you might actually do in practice. But in going back to kind of the kind of mapping approach even that we chose, we always envisaged that we would rerun the maps when new evidence comes available, when actions start to take place, and be even able to track kind of how things progress. So that was one of the key asks when we put that piece of work out for tender, was that we would actually get that model that we can then rerun, not just the maps themselves, so that when new evidence does come available, we can, you know, feed that in. Potentially not that relevant in terms of species, but those species layers are always going to be something that we would be looking at on top of those kind of more spatially explicit kind of habitat focused data sets. So quite a lengthy answer, but I hope that makes sense in terms of what I was trying to get across. Is there something that you want to add to that, Jamie?
I'm really pleased with what you said, actually, in that it's any map you produce is out of date as soon as you published it.
Snapshot in time.
Exactly. So
potentially several spaces in time, actually.
So when people often say, well, we don't know enough about X, Y, Z, usually that is a moving set of goalposts. You can't keep up with that. But the really important thing is, like you said, widening out to be the expert knowledge. Anyone could just take, well, I say anyone that can do the modeling, not me, someone else can take the maps and pretend that they've come up with the perfect, modeled network. But if it doesn't involve that local expertise and that local knowledge within it, it's just fundamentally flawed, because a lot of that knowledge isn't on a map. It's within the people that are out there all the time experiencing and understanding the landscape. And we've got that with habitats, which of course are much easier to understand the distribution of and quality of than invertebrate assemblages, which are, another layer of complexity. So we're struggling to do that with habitats. We're going to struggle even more with species and the gaps we've got in species data, which is why sometimes, although you need to acknowledge there are gaps, you should never try and say, this is perfect, we have everything we need, we know where everything is. It's a case of trying to do as best a job you can with what you've got, while not claiming to be solving everything, but trying to say, this is the best we can do at the moment, acknowledge there are limitations, but just because something isn't perfect doesn't mean it shouldn't be brought forward, I suppose, is my long-winded addition to your much more succinct comment.
Yeah, so thank you. So I suppose I'll take back to the, Helen does have a question. I suppose, yeah, Helen.
I was just going to say that I'm a great fan of maps and so on as well. And one of the things that's really important to me as a museum-based person is looking at historic data held in museum collections. And I wonder how many people actually access that old information of insects and creatures that were collected in historic times, because those will tell a great deal about the habitat that they lived in, 100 years ago. And it's very, very important to make sure that that information is available. And museums globally have this great drive now to actually try and digitize and capture all the all the information on the insect labels or on their plant, whatever, pressed plants, and make this information available for research. So I think there's a lot of information available going back 100 years, which will tell you how the habitats were in the past and could be really, really valuable to include in your models.
Ooh, yeah, I suppose jumping on that in the sense of so I did see, I think, in during the presentation that it's only data from the 1990s that are sort of thing. Is it the case that there could even be like a comparative, like a historic IIA based on museum data and compared to what it's like now to see how it's changed or something?
Certainly. I mean, I got first-hand experience, not at this museum, but at a different museum, actually looking at data that had been collected some 50 years earlier and going back to sites and seeing how things had changed. And it was, if that museum material and information hadn't been available, the study wouldn't be possible. And it was really effective. So I'm not saying that every museum's got data to the level that might be as useful, but certainly in some groups and some taxa, there will be stuff. And if you go to several museums, because quite a lot of stuff from Ireland is actually in the Natural History Museum in London or in the Smithsonian and various others. So you wouldn't just go to one place, you'd have to look in several to get all of that. But with everything going online and being shared through GBIF and platforms like that, the information should be there. And then if there are any questions, you can go back to the original museum just to verify things.
Wait, well, I think I see Nina's hand up there first.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, I think it's a hugely valuable topic of conversation, looking back at what used to be somewhere. I guess you can probably, Josh, give a better answer on, species records and that sort of thing, and how good of a database we might have for that in Northern Ireland. But it's definitely something that I've always, it's a tricky balance, isn't it? Because we need to acknowledge that, we can't be too tied to trying to return to what used to be, let's say, restoring or recreating habitats that used to be. It could be that we've moved and our climate has changed too much for us to try to kind of really concentrate on that too much. But it's still a useful reference point if the information was there, looking at historic maps of, even land use and land cover, even just to sense check, if we're designing a project and we think this is what we should do, if we focus just in my head on habitats and you know, what we might restore or recreate, let's say, getting rid of flood defense walls and allowing kind of more natural kind of tidal excursion and that sort of thing. It's definitely, if the information is there, a hugely valuable research in terms of referring back to, you know, what the processes used to be like, because in an ideal world, obviously you would be allowing for the natural processes to return, but at the same time knowing and being aware of the fact that it could be that we can go to access exactly what used to be. But obviously species is another question, and maybe that's a question to you, Josh, in terms of, you know, how good databases for, you know, invertebrates do we have going back in Northern Ireland? I wouldn't have a very good know-how on that front, but yeah, going back to the kind of shifting baselines, I think that's something that we need to be very aware of as well, as much as we can. You know, obviously we want to bring back those natural processes and not think about what used to be 10 years ago, but thinking back of what we might have had in the past and how much can we recreate or allow to rewild or whatever that might be, obviously based on the location. I think, you know, we need to be bold too, and those references points in the history are potentially really, really useful.
Definitely, yeah. Okay. So I see Brian has his hand up next.
Yeah, just coming in on that comment from Helen, I totally agree with her. Museums are a vast store thing, and you should always restrict the old data. I think, however, in Ireland there are very good reasons why you eventually hit not a brick wall, but you do eventually find yourself getting data that's from the same site all the time. There weren't very many entomologists. They couldn't travel about very far. They tended to all go to the same places. So I've done that with my own groups. I've gone and collected all the old data, and you end up with a peppering of sites about Ireland, which are mostly related to where trains ended up. The Burren, which is probably our most important invertebrate area, was simply not visited by any entomologist till the 1940s, really. And yet, if you look at the modern maps, and I'll show one tomorrow, the Burren stands out as the single most important site in Ireland for insects, and yet that's only really been discovered since the 1950s. So yeah, historical data will bring you a wee bit along the way, but don't expect there to be a vast untapped resource for Ireland, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for that. I do see Jimmy wrote something there in the chat box that is very sort of relevant in terms of, I suppose, it looks into, if I'm reading it right, in terms of the historic stuff, where some species are now in sites that might not have been originally the preferred habitats or a surrogate site in comparison to their old time. So that's something to consider as well. If Jimmy can probably word that much better. So he's
we often, you know, we assume that what we've got left is the best of what's left, and that's why it's got the species. But sometimes it might simply be a case of it is literally the last option for species. It might have had a relative, well, not completely different, but slightly different habitat preference back in the day. But now that the options are much more restricted, we it's a bit self-fulfilling in a way, because we go to a place where we expect to find them and we keep looking for the same thing in that habitat and think it's because it likes that habitat, as opposed to it being that's all that's left for it within the wider landscape, now that we've kind of lost some of those wider ecological processes. I mean, you know, invertebrates find a way. I mean, a lot of my expertise at Buglife has been around brownfield habitats. And of course, you know, those are often kind of surrogates for semi-natural habitats that have kind of declined in the wider landscape, or the fine scale mosaics that are often lost in a relatively more homogeneous managed landscape. So, you know, it's obvious that those brownfield specialists, for example, that I focus on in the Thames Estuary with a lot of my work, it's obvious that they're, you know, go back 100 years ago, they weren't associated with brownfields in the Thames Estuary because those brownfields weren't there. But now that's all that's left. So now we've if you just went on the current data, you'd think that's where they should be. But yeah, look, I'm trying to say that historic data might have something more to it in terms of not just finding out where they were before, but the historic habitats they might have been associated with as well. So there's something about overlapping that habitat and species data.
Yeah. I think there's actually going to be an interesting talk tomorrow in the conference on ghost ponds, so like ponds that show up on maps, but or in old maps but are no longer there. And the talk will be about restoring those ponds and seeing all the different invertebrates that come back to those. But I suppose I want to get back to the general theme is in terms of how important invertebrate areas as well as nature recovery networks would look like on an all Ireland basis. Like we know, or we've I suppose experienced like the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which is probably like the biggest scope of kind of looking across Ireland. But well, I suppose the first thing is like what's the really like the main barriers to making that sort of all Ireland approach? What the biggest barriers to that? If yeah,
Can I come in on that?
Yep.
Well, our favorite topic, Brexit, probably doesn't help. You know, I think even before Brexit, you know, we had divergence in policies and how we monitor outside and how we even, you know, categorize our habitats and coding systems and that sort of thing. So you can even look at potentially cross-border sites, designated sites that have been kind of surveyed using a different methodology on one side of the border to the other. So obviously Brexit is potentially even going to add to that in terms of you know, divergence. And I think it's a big concern, and it's something that the sector here in Northern Ireland and, you know, us, you know, overall in the whole island of Ireland are definitely concerned about and conversing about as well at the moment, because obviously in an ideal world we would be looking at the whole island of Ireland as a one biogeographical unit. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but that was part of the reason, you know, those maps that we produced, if we had information from across the border, we included that. So we didn't just stop our modeling even at the border for that very reason, because that, you know, nature doesn't stop at the border. So I think it's a hugely important conversation that we need to have. And in an ideal world, you know, we would have, it doesn't mean that the policies need to look exactly the same and projects need to look exactly the same, but we would have ways of taking complementary action on both sides of the border. And why not have big cross-border initiatives? You know, we are lucky at the same time to have big funding pots as well still available to us, you know, Interreg, Bees Plus coming up and that sort of thing. So we do have opportunities to kind of, I guess, reduce that risk. So I think it's both a big risk in terms of that divergence, but at the same time, we are small enough as an island to actually consider this on an, you know, on an all island basis as well. So in an ideal world, you know, we would be talking about an all island nature network, and the all island, you know, pollinator plan is a great example of where we could take a lot of learnings from, because it works on an all island basis and it has been hugely successful. So I think there's a lot that we could take from that initiative in terms of implementing any more wider, you know, NRN sort of type approach for the whole island of Ireland. But at the same time, there's a lot more conversion that will need to take place when we haven't really figured it out for Northern Ireland, even in the first instance. But yeah, it's a really important conversation to be had.
Thank you. Oh, Jimmy, how's this?
Sorry, I'm going to say, what I'm not going to try and do for a moment is try to say that I understand any of the barriers in Ireland to this. But an interesting thing to highlight from the GB example is that even between England and Wales, there were issues of differing priorities, which still caused friction with some people we were engaged with, which based on the fact that, for example, you might get, there's a number of species that are fairly ubiquitous in southeast England, but they've got one site in Wales. So in Wales, they're considered a great rarity. And the conflict comes, of course, when we're not considering it a priority species within the GB-wide IA mapping. because it's so common in Southeast England, at the GB level, it's considered least concern. But in Wales, it's only found at a single site. So in the Wales context, it's a really important species and site. And people get very disappointed that, when Welsh entomologists are rightly interested in species within Wales, and they can't understand why a site which they think is really special for this species isn't considered as an IA because that species doesn't qualify. So it's something to worth considering at the earliest opportunity, how you might have those different clashes of priority and how you'd overcome that.
Well, I suppose like things that is it even where you have you have the main IIA, but then you also have local IIAs, if that makes any sense, or another.
We're talking about the idea of tiering IAs here.
Yeah, is that too? Yeah.
Open season for ideas. I like it.
Brian.
Yeah, come back in here again. Sorry to keep coming back in, but yeah, I mean Nina's point is right, but GB is got 3 different countries which all have conservation. Conservation is a devolved matter in GB, so it's not any different in Ireland. Okay, it's an independent country and part of the UK, but we're across on the border does have a policy difference. There's a different setup in. I'm not going to explain, pretend to understand the differences, but there's different planning in the Republic of Northern Ireland. So the policy, how the policy is done is different as it is in GB, but the information, I'm a bit dismayed you haven't recognised that biological recording in Ireland has always been at an all Ireland level. The border does not make any difference, and biologists do not record on an all Ireland basis. It's not just a pollinator plan. There's been loads of atlases that cover Ireland as a unit, and long may that continue, because you can't understand the species in Northern Ireland if you don't understand it in the rest of Ireland, and vice versa. So the idea of having a little map of Ireland with a little bit cut out, or the other way around of map of UK is never been done. So our red lists are all Ireland, and long may that continue. So on the biological recording level, on the information gathering level, everything is done on an all Ireland basis in terms of biology. Where there are differences is no more, or well, it is probably more than it is in Britain, but it is still the same problem exists in Britain as it does here.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I was just kind of providing that as an example of something that has been released. It sort of brings into that concept of kind of tackling, making sort of conservation steps and approaches that will tackle like fill and partner planners and methods of management and conservation. It's kind of been idealized and stuff, or sort of mentioned. So it's more that approach rather than the biological recording aspect itself. It's the more the conservation approaches and how that may be different between both. Yeah. So any further questions, or? Oh, sort of gone quiet there. Oh.
We must have been so thorough in our responses, Jamie and Josh. Oh, Andrew's hand is up, I can see.
Yep. Oh, okay.
Great talks, thanks everyone. Yeah, well, it sounds like barring a bit of funding and some resources, we are ready to get cracking with an all-Ireland important invertebrate area map.
Yeah. So yeah, like yeah, so is suppose any like smaller sort of questions in comparison to the all Ireland stuff is like in terms of So like certain features and stuff of habitats, like obviously there's the bigger, grander habitat, but then there's also things like micro habitats and things. Do they play a part in any of the nature recovery networks, or things that might change seasonally or throughout the years?
I mean, in principle, of course, yes, and goes back to me kind of saying, or what I referred to earlier in terms of, you know, reinstating natural processes and that sort of thing. I think that's part of what habitats naturally end up being if there weren't any humans on this planet, you know. And I think that's another thing I always end up talking about when we talk about the maps, because they look very much like blankets across landscapes. And I always try to talk about them as kind of soft borders. It's highlighting within this area that we've buffered around existing sites, for example. You know, we know that the conditions are likely to be correct for there to be potential for the creation or restoration of a particular habitat type. But we don't naturally have, you know, these blanket habitats. In terms of actually being able to map that and showcase this as part of the maps, I think that would be extremely challenging. And that's definitely not to the kind of fine detail that the maps are able to go, at least at this point in time, in terms of the way we've approached it. But again, it goes back to how you translate the maps into actual on-the-ground delivery and how you go about your projects, and acknowledging that obviously in principle, you know, we are not talking about these blankets, we're talking about complex systems and little niches, having variability in elevation, which naturally brings these microhabitats and changes, and also allowing, you know, being, as you might have picked up, you know, I'm not originally from Northern Ireland, but from Finland, and I always struggle with this kind of obsession with management and the need to control our environment, but actually, you know, imagine if we could, you know, have these systems that naturally change and fluctuate, which is what naturally would happen, especially, you know, with climate change. And I think that's definitely something that where we need to kind of have a bit of a change in mindsets. You know, sure, it's easy for me to say that, you know, coming from Finland, where we have a lot less people versus land area, so we are not so restricted in terms of what we have left. But it's something that I often talk about or think about when it comes to us talking about it with, you know, nature recovery networks. How do we look after these sites in the long term? How do we manage them? Whereas in a natural functioning system, you know, things are in a constant flux and they are quite complex, and, you know, it's not about controlling them and keeping them as one blanket habitat, but making sure that the natural change is able to happen, but also that we get those microhabitats and we get those changes, which is hopefully, in a lot of occasions, you know, the right thing for that place to do. Obviously, it's not relevant to every single place, and especially when we have lost a lot of our, you know, big predators and that sort of thing, our system is quite off balance in terms of us needing to take certain actions, such as, you know, predator control for ground nesting birds and that sort of thing, if rather than, you know, letting just everything rewild, which is never going to happen or work perfectly everywhere. But I do think that that conversation about, you know, natural processes and natural changes and complex systems is something that is a real key, and the risk is that we create these blanket habitats, which is not where we need or want to go. I know it's not an exact answer, but hopefully there's some more questions just to stir the pot even further.
Thank you. See, Helen.
I was just going to say something I've realized or noticed since I've moved here, and for the record, I moved here from South Africa just about a year ago. I initially thought that if one left a habitat that had been disturbed and let it go and regrow by itself, that would be a good thing to do, because that's the sort of background I come from. And I've realized here that, in fact, there's very little in the way of natural grazing, and the habitats are very much needing some sort of management. I never really actually thought I'd ever hear myself saying that, but I see that some management is actually needed to cut things and simulate grazing and so on. Otherwise, it just becomes all bramble and bracken, and everything gets shaded out, and things plants and things under that can actually die out, and diversity is lost. So that was a huge, just amazing moment for me to realize this. It's a very different concept to what I'm used to from somewhere that has much more open space in a very, very different environment. I just thought I'd share that observation, which might be obvious to everyone else, but it hadn't been to me.
Thank you. Ooh, okay, so any further questions? Okay, so I suppose I'll consider that silence as no more questions. But yeah, I suppose I'll wrap it up then. It's almost half 8 there. So I just want to say thank you very much, first of all, to our 2 speakers, Nina and Jimmy, and to everyone who's joined in and asked questions and everything. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Josh, for having us and putting this all together. It was excellent. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, brilliant. Thanks everyone for your input. Cheers, Josh. Well done.